Okay, the procedure is as usual. I will make few opening remarks about faith and human rights, particularly in context of globalization. And then we have two guests who will serve as our resource persons. I again, as when Tony Blair is here, I'm a sidekick here. Our two main guests are whatever they are to me then, if I'm their sidekick, okay? So on the one hand, we've observed that there is this, over the past 50 years or so, the spread of the language of human rights around the globe. And some see in it a new global moral code, some even a new religion. But on the other hand, we observed in our readings a contestation of the meaning of human rights. Some rights that were affirmed, for instance, very clearly, unambiguous in UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 were kind of attenuated, expressed in an attenuated form a bit later on. And some scholars, I think Aniket has mentioned that in his own recent conversation, some scholars even suggest that were that Declaration on Human Rights to be voted today, it would not pass, right? Because the differences and on account of more nations coming into the UN, as well as kind of higher profile of some of the particularist interests are present there. So on the one hand, you've got a universal language. On the other hand, internally very much contested. So what is going on? Can human rights serve as a common values in our globalized world? How are human rights related to particular religious traditions and communal and national cultures? And maybe the most fundamental of the questions, and some of you have heard me speak that I think we need to start thinking about how to formulate issues that we are addressing here in forms of very precise fundamental questions. So maybe fundamental question for us today is, first, do we need something like common values in our globalized world? And if we do need common values, what level of commonality is needed? And how to achieve that in our very much pluralistic world. Likelihood of consensus, and of course the question is then significant issues around the problem of imposition of one particular account of those. And Professor Clarke has addressed some of these issues. So I want to highlight in my comments here two areas. One is the question of the universality of human rights, and the other one is the relationship between religion and human rights. Now, in a sense, what you have is one phrase, but different meanings. And it is clear that across the globe, we don't mean exactly the same thing when we speak of human rights. We don't use the phrase univocally. But we use also, do we use the phrase to mean completely different things? I'm not sure. I grew up in former Yugoslavia, a communist country, and I remember during the Cold War, we had this debate about human rights and understanding of human rights. And in my part of the world, it were understood as positive rights, which the state is supposed to guarantee for you, and then bourgeois account of human rights as negative rights, which you have over against the state. That may be a case of radically different accounts of human rights, though even there, I'm not quite sure. And it may be that we are using the phrase not exactly in the same way and not quite in a different way, but something like an analogous way, that there is an overlapping understanding of how we across the globe use the phrase human rights. So partial overlaps in the meaning of that phrase. And these partial overlaps in the meaning of the phrase is, I think, significant because on the one hand, we have in human rights a universal claim. It's a claim that these are rights of all people qua human beings. But on the other hand, we have all of these formulations of human rights are made out of a particular cultural, religious perspective. And that may seem to create a certain form of attention. A particular thing is claimed as universal. And I think that's what the debates are often about, because from a particular perspective, it is formulated what rights of human beings, qua human beings, ought to be. And I think a given way of formulating rights depends partly on what we in this course have been calling accounts of self, social relations, and the good. So you may affirm the same right, but depending on your broader account of reality, you may mean different things by that. And I think, and maybe we can discuss this later on, there's something like religious rights. You can see that in religious rights. Freedom of exercise, religious rights can be understood, or freedom to choose one's own religion. Now, if you have a freedom of exercise understanding, then you have an understanding, I think, of the self of an individual already defined in some significant way by social relations, Catholic, a Jew, or Muslim, and communities having some stake in the self being part of that network of particular relations, and then having difficulty with that person wants to leave. If you have understanding of religious rights as rights of choice, the self is then situated within communities, maybe is also partly shaped by them, but self is fundamentally independent of those, understood as independent of those communities, free to define itself over against any given community. So this is how particular accounts of self, social relations, and the good shape what we understood by human rights. Now, when we talk about universality, I think and from a particular perspective, its significant issue is how do we negotiate between competing universal claims? Right? That's one of the issues that has been brought up in our discussion. And in a sense, we know how to do that on a national levels, right? We have vigorous debates. Sort of reproductive rights issue can be given as an example. We have vigorous public debates that hopefully clarify issues. Maybe they muddle them a little bit, but nonetheless, there is a back and forth in a large political arena. Then we vote, right? And then move on in such a way. A significant issue for us, a central issue for us, how do we negotiate competing universal claims at the global level? That's a challenge. Now, next point that I wanted to bring up is a relationship between religion and rights. We're not here simply to talk about the importance of rights within the globalized setting and the difficulty of formulating those, but how religion plays into that issue. And we've seen in our reading a number of different texts that we've read address that issue. One perspective might be that we are dealing here with competing moral universes. Abu al-Fadl, you recall, said the tensions between convictional systems of religion and human rights, he said, can be put this way. Which of these two generalized and objectified systems warrants deference, and which constitutes the ultimate frame of reference, right? Which is the ultimate one, that this is competing moral universes. We've seen others who suggested those are subordinated moral claims. Theology or faith states ultimate and general norms. Human rights reflection articulates specific norms that are to be subordinated to those. And then we'll see also a certain complementarity accounts of that. And I think John's account that we have read is in part one that subordinates and partly also emphasizes complementarity, if I read John's account rightly. So that's one area of relationship between religion and rights. What trumps what in some sense, or how the relationship is to be construed. But another area is the question of justification and motivation. Justification of rights and motivation for observance of rights. And I think that's a very important issue. Human rights culture and institutions can be sustained only if they are seen as justified, if they're seen in some significant sense as morally legitimate. Prevalent custom, can be argued, is not enough for justification. This is simply what we here do, this is what we civilized folks do, or whatever that else might be, because it ends up being a matter of imposition by various forms of power. And also rights, when rights matter the most, they matter the most when much is at stake. And when much is at stake, the motivation to respect those rights often needs justifications, intellectual justifications, both to ourselves and also to others. So that justification of rights is already in and of itself motivation for observing those rights. But religions provide, quite apart from justifications, also other forms of motivation for respect of human rights. Respect for rights of others demands care of others. I mean, respect for one's own rights or claiming one's own rights doesn't. It requires only sufficient amount of self-centeredness, right? And standing upon one's own rights. But human rights culture will thrive if each of us is not simply concerned about our own rights, but rights of others as well. And that presumes care for the other person, for the rights of the others. And care for others is something that most of the religious traditions feel that they inculcate. They're not the only groups that inculcate that, but they certainly do that. So that's the question of the importance of the issue. But there's also a question which Nick Walterstorff Nick Walterstorff piece has raised, and that is non-religious justification of rights possible, right? And non-religious justifications of rights, they primarily run through capacities or normal functioning. You have certain kind of capacities which make you a candidate for being bearer of rights, or your normal functioning of those capacities make you a candidate for being a bearer of those rights. Nick has argued, as you have seen in that text, and Nick, by the way, is going to be with us next week. Sorry, 2 weeks. Next week when we meet, right? But which will be in 2 weeks. And he's going to be part of our discussions about liberal democracy, but we're reading his text on human rights. He has argued that these accounts, capacity-based or normal functioning-based justification of human rights, well, they don't justify human rights, rights of human beings qua human. They justify rights of certain humans with certain functions. And therefore, they're not broad enough to justify, to give account of the notion of human rights. Nick has argued that we need religious justifications of human rights, God as endowing human beings with certain inalienable rights. Now, he's clarified his position in the sense that he says, well, sometimes even religious justification of human rights in the end amount to capacities justifications. God has given you certain capacities. On the virtue of these capacities, you have rights. And Nick says, no, that's not going to work. And that's not going to work exactly for the same reason while secular capacities accounts of human rights don't work, because they don't cover all instances of human beings, but only those who have these types of capacities. And Nick's argument is that God's love for human beings, attachment to human beings, in some way relationship, concrete relationship to human beings, bestows upon people inalienable rights. And his example, you will recall if you read this text, my favorite one is a teddy bear example. So what gives worth to a particular teddy bear for a kid? Well, a history of attachment to that teddy bear, and that teddy bear may not win any award in the context for the nicest of all teddy bears. Indeed, it may be all torn up and in complete disrepair, but nonetheless, that's the most favorite teddy bear of all teddy bears for that child. That's the image for Nick Walterstorff for the relationship between God and human beings, which then grants and gives, bestows value, and therefore also rights to human beings. Those are a rough summary of some of the things that we've been reading in our text, as well as the issues that have surfaced in our discussions. But now to expand this discussion, we have with us two guests, and I will ask first Professor Witte from Emory to address us for 15 minutes, and then Professor Clarke from our own Yale here.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Volf, and good afternoon to each of you. It's great to be back here at Yale to enjoy the very warm weather that you've put on for me coming from the south. I look forward to having a robust discussion together today on some of the fundamentals of faith and freedom. And in the article that was circulated to you and in the brief remarks today, I'd like to make the argument that faith is essential to freedom and that religion is critical to human rights. This year we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's hard but important to remember that this document was born out of desperation in the aftermath of World War II, out of painful recognition that both Christianity and the Enlightenment had failed to deliver on their promises. In the middle of the 20th century, there was no second coming of Christ promised by Christians, no heavenly city of reason promised by enlightened libertarians, no withering away of the state promised by enlightened socialists. Instead, there was world war, gulags, and the Holocaust, a vile and an evil fascism, irrationalism, and totalitarianism to which Christianity and the Enlightenment seemed to have no cogent response or effective deterrent. The Universal Declaration was an earnest attempt to codify and to fill out what are the core ingredients of a world faith to fill a spiritual void. It was an attempt to harvest from the traditions of Christianity and the Enlightenment and other faith communities the rudimentary elements of a new faith and a new law that would unite a badly broken world order. The proud claims of Article 1 of the Declaration that all men are born free and equal in rights and dignity and are endowed with reason and conscience expounded the primitive truths of the tradition, but with little basis in post-war world reality. Freedom and equality were hard to find anywhere. Reason and conscience had just blatantly betrayed themselves in the gulags, battlefields, and death camps. Though desperate in origin, the human rights movement grew precociously in the decades following World War II. The United Nations issued a number of landmark documents on human rights in the 1950s and 1960s, especially the great 1966 Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, and elaborated their basic provisions in a number of follow-up declarations and conventions and understandings on issues of genocide, of violence, of torture, and of gender and racial discrimination in a variety of forms of public life. Various nation states pressed their own human rights movements in a variety of discrete ways. In America, the Rights Revolution issued a powerful grassroots civil rights movement and a welter of landmark cases and statutes that made real, sometimes for the first time, the guarantees of the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. In Africa and Latin America, it produced agitation and eventually revolt against colonial and autocratic rule. Academics throughout the world produced a prodigious new literature, urging constant reform and expansion of the human rights regime. Within a generation, human rights had become what the New York Times in 1973 called for the first time the new civic faith of the post-war world order. Christian, Jewish, and various other religious communities participated actively as midwives in the birth of this modern rights revolution, and special religious rights protections were at first actively pursued and instantiated. Individual religious groups issued bold confessional statements and manifestos on human rights shortly after World War II. Several denominations and budding ecumenical bodies joined in the cultivation of human rights at the international level. The Free Church tradition in particular played a critical role in the civil rights movement in America, as did Christian democratic Catholic movements in Europe and in Latin America and in parts of Francophone Africa. But after expressing some initial interest, leaders of the rights revolution consigned religious groups and their unique religious rights claims to a lower and lower priority. Freedom of speech and press, parity of race and gender, provision of work and welfare captured most of the energy and emoluments of the rights revolution. After the 1960s and early 1970s, academic inquiries and activist interventions into religious rights and their abuses became increasingly intermittent and isolated. New constitutional laws emerged in the United States and in Western Europe that began to demand that laws and legal arguments be grounded in secular purposes and directed to secular ends in order to pass constitutional muster. The rights revolution, both in international law and in a variety of domestic laws, seemed to be passing religion by. And this deprecation of the special roles and the special rights of religions in the last third of the 20th century or so has introduced a number of distortions into the current theory of human rights that tends to dominate discussions today. First, without religion, many rights are cut from their roots. The right to religion, the great German jurist Jörg Jelinek wrote a century ago, is the mother of many other rights. For the religious individual, the right to believe and to exercise that belief leads ineluctably to the rights to assemble, to speak, to travel, to worship, to proselytize, to educate, to parent, and other actions taken on the direct foundation of those beliefs. For the religious group, the right to exist invariably involves rights to corporate organization, group property, collective worship, organized charity, parochial education, freedom of press, autonomy of governance, transnational contracts, and much more. To ignore religious rights is often to overlook the conceptual source of many other individual and associational rights. And it's also to ignore the historical source of many of our most cherished constitutional freedoms. It's an instructive anecdote, for example, that by 1650, every one of the rights that would eventually appear in the American Bill of Rights of 1789 had already been fully theoretically formulated and defended by Christian writers who were elaborating what they considered to be the essential correlative rights of the cardinal right to freedom of conscience and freedom of exercise. And if one looks in the post-colonial, post-autocratic regimes, oftentimes the formulation of the religious rights of the individual and the religious rights of the group provide the constitutional traction for the elaboration of a variety of correlative rights that are attached thereto and eventually constitutionally instanced. Second, without religion, the regime of human rights is in danger of becoming infinitely expandable. The classic faiths of the world community adopt and advocate human rights in part in order to protect religious duties. A religious individual or a religious association has rights to exist and act not in the abstract, but in order to discharge discrete duties defined by their faith commitments and faith communities. Rights and duties properly belong together in most religious traditions. To speak of one without the other is ultimately destructive. Rights without duties to guide them quickly become claims of self-indulgence. Duties without rights to exercise them quickly become sources of deep guilt. Religious traditions, amongst others, offer some of the best examples of the organic linkage between rights and duties and thereby put a natural check and balance on the limitless expansion of human rights into a simple gaggle of ungrounded whimsical wishes and wants that have no real ontological foundation and no real chance of becoming real in practice. Third, without religion, the state is given an exaggerated role to play as the guarantor of human rights. The simple state versus individual dialectic of many modern human rights theories leaves it to the state to protect, provide, and vindicate rights of all sorts. In reality, the state is not and cannot be so omnicompetent as the failed socialist experiments of the 20th century have tragically shown us. Numerous mediating structures or spheres of justice stand between the state and the individual, religious communities prominently amongst them. Religious institutions or communities, amongst many others, play a vital role in the cultivation and in the realization of many types of rights. They can create the conditions and sometimes the prototypes for some of the first-generation civil and political rights. They can provide a critical, and in some communities, the principal means to meet second-generation rights of education, health care, child care, labor, employment, artistic opportunities, and much more. And religious communities offer some of the deepest insights into the norms of creation, stewardship, and servanthood that lie at the heart of what we now call third-generation rights of peace, orderly development, environmental protection.